You're looking at a picture of Stone Barns and Blue Hill, the restaurant in Pecanico Hills, New York, which is about 20 miles outside of Manhattan. It's a farm and a restaurant and an education center on an old Rockefeller estate. And I wanted to take the opportunity to show you some pictures of it. It's a beautiful place. In fact, as I'm looking at it, I was just in the mindset of I wish I worked there, and in fact I do work there, but I never walk around the property. And so this morning I just wanted to open up with two short stories, and in the background show you some pictures of the context of the stories. The first story is about carrots, and the second story is about castration. So, right into the first story. The first story involves a dinner that I prepared late this past winter, but I guess it began right after the Christmas break, and we came back to open up Stone Barns, and I was a little depressed. We were going into the winter, and the fall harvest was over, and people come to this restaurant, not necessarily to eat my food, although I tend to think that, but much more to taste the splendor of what's produced in the greenhouse and in the fields. We raise 5 acres of cultivated vegetables, half an acre in the greenhouse, and we raise animals on 22 acres of open pasture. So there's quite a bit of produce and animals to eat and enjoy in the restaurant. But in the winter, it tends to slow down a little bit, and as January came around, dark clouds of potatoes and cabbages were on the horizon here. So I was trying to come up with an idea that would be original, especially with carrots that were coming out of the greenhouse, and were delicious. These Napoli carrots are an old variety of carrots that are incredibly sweet and tasty. And lo and behold, I get a phone call from my friend Olivier. And Olivier has just returned from France. And Olivier is a distributor, a friend and a distributor. And he's a distributor of my favorite flavored oils, nut oils, by a man named Jean-Marc. And Jean-Marc is in Burgundy, and his quality of the oils he produces is bar none the best in the world. He charges for it, and we're a big customer because I can't use anything else. And once you've tasted these oils, you can't go back to anything else either. So at any rate, he was on the phone. He told me he just returned to get what was Jean-Marc's new crop. In Burgundy, Jean-Marc makes his oils in this ridiculously old school French tradition in his garage, and he's artisanal to the extent that you can imagine an old Frenchman in Burgundy is. And so anyway, he went to lunch with Jean-Marc, and he arrived at his home and walked into the kitchen, and he smelled an overwhelming scent of almonds. And he said, an almond souffle for lunch or an almond tart for dessert. But on the stove, we're sauteing potatoes. And he was confused, and he sat down to eat this plate of sauteed potatoes, and still only could smell almonds and taste almonds as he ate the plate of sauteed potatoes. And he turned to Jean-Marc. He said, I don't understand it. All I'm tasting and all I'm smelling is almonds, and yet I'm eating your sauteed potatoes. And Jean-Marc said, oh, well, after I press the almonds from my almond oil, instead of throwing away the dust, the residue, I put it on my potato fields. And through this, I don't know, osmosis, the potatoes soak up almond flavor, and you get almond-flavored potatoes. So he told me the story, and I thought, eureka, this is for me, for the winter. I called a California organic almond producer. I got to speak to the vice president, and I put in an order for 200 pounds of his almond nut residue. He thought I was nuts, and along came the 200 pounds. We planted the 3 rows of Napoli carrots in the greenhouse, and I involved the waiters and the cooks I involved everybody in the process because I was so excited about it. We waited 6 weeks. The valets got into it. The receptionists got into it. Everyone got involved with the planting and the weeding and et cetera. So 6 weeks plus, the day of the harvest came, I actually had a dream the night before that I was on the cover of Gourmet magazine with a farmer's hat, me holding a bunch of carrots with the title, Dan Barber, Chef Revolutionizes Farming, something like that. It's a true dream. So anyway, the meal came, and for some reason the harvest was late, and I had already put the special on as an almond carrot salad, very simple, and orders were trickling into the kitchen when the last of the carrots were cleaned, and I started slicing them, and I went to taste them to put together the salad, and no almond flavor, zero, zilch, not even a whiff, a promise of almond flavor in the future. There was nothing. So I recovered amazingly quickly because I'm under pressure. I'm not usually that good. And I reached for Jean-Marc's almond oil, and I poured it over the carrots for the almond salad and created the taste of almonds. And I served it to the waiters, and they said, "Oh my God, this scientific experiment works. Ferran Adria, Ferran Adria has foams. Dan Barber has almond carrots." We served it out into the dining room. It was a huge success. We sold, I think we did 140 covers that night. We sold 95 almond carrot salads, and it was a huge success. People wrote comment cards with 4 stars and the exceptional meal of their life, and people called the next week and wrote letters. And in fact, a chef called 2 weeks later, a very famous chef in New York who I hadn't talked to in 5 years, and made little chit chat, and then at the end said, "Hey, I hear something about some almond carrots that you're growing. Could I get a case?" So it's sort of the power of stories and what's happening on the farm, and I kind of wanted to try and relate in the moments in the rest of my little presentation here to a pig. And what you're looking at is Boris, our boar, or he was our boar, and Boris, he's still very much alive, but he's sort of stopped performing as a boar, and this is very recent, as of this spring. The story is I was on the shaded hilltop here, watching Boris try and make love to a sow, and that's Boris just after being shunned from the sow. And what I watched is the sows who were at the height of being in heat. And I don't know if any of you have seen a sow in heat, but suffice to say they are not picky. But every time Boris tried to mount the sow, she would run away. And cat-like moves, I mean, it's big animals, and just the nimbleness of getting away from Boris, and the intent of not being mounted, because they felt that Boris is about 950 pounds and extremely fat in the middle, and they felt that, that they would be crushed by Boris's weight. So they would run into this little steel hut that was too small for Boris to get into. So he would go crazy outside the hut, he would calm down, the ladies would come out, he would try again, and after about 20 minutes, he gave up and fell asleep in the corner. And I was standing on the hilltop with Craig Haney, who's our livestock farmer, and Craig turned to me and took off his cap and scratched his head and said, "Next week I'm going to shoot Boris." And I said, "You're going to what? How could you possibly shoot Boris?" And as a guy about to hit middle age, my heart went out to Boris. And I said, and I looked at Craig, and Craig looked at me, also equally as confused, and we had this kind of stare down. And I immediately gave up because I realized I know nothing about boars, and I know nothing about what you do with a boar who doesn't perform. But I did some research, and I wanted to share it with you. There are a few options. One is what Craig suggested, which is just shoot him and bury him, take him out back, shoot him between the eyes, dig a hole, bury him, end of story. And in some ways the easiest, but in truth, the negatives, of course, are that you're wasting what, 700 or 800 pounds of sausage meat, which to me seemed like an enormous waste of a life and what I presume to be a tasty life. So second option is natural death. You let Boris live out his days on our farm, and we feed him twice a day, and he'll probably live for another 1.5 to 2 years. The problems with that are related to cost. And the cost of keeping Boris alive, well, it's $40 a month for organic feed. If we were feeding conventional feed, it'd be about $20 a month. A whole ton of kitchen scraps, which presumably are free. Water, which we have to lug up the hillside. And then the labor involved with keeping him alive and keeping him happy is not small. It's a lot of work. And the opportunity cost of keeping Boris on prime land prevents other pigs from eating this terrific sort of savanna that he's occupied now. And then, of course, you could just slaughter Boris. In slaughtering him, again, that's sort of an easy option. You could just take him 2 hours north to the slaughterhouse. The problem is something called boar taint, which I learned all about. And boar taint, it turns out, courses through a boar's veins, and it looks like heavily through Boris's veins, and creates a acrid taste, a taste of meat that I ended up tasting a few weeks ago in the form of a ram that was slaughtered, and we tried to make sausage out of it. And I couldn't even get within inches of the ram's meat. It was so off-putting, and from what I've heard, boars are 10 times worse. So basically, we'd go to slaughter and we'd have unusable meat, unless, and this is the fourth option, castration. If you castrate Boris and you wait 3 months, testosterone eases out of his system, and you remove boar taint, and you basically get a pig with a huge amount of fat and great for making sausages. The problem, of course, is this. It's not a small operation. And I also learned you can't put Boris to sleep. There's no such thing as anesthetizing Boris because you'll kill him. There's like a 95% chance that giving him anesthesia will kill him. So that's not an option, so you've got to perform this procedure while he's awake. And if you've seen Boris, I've seen Boris when he's randy, I've also seen him when he's mad, and in both cases, I don't want to be near him. So it's certainly an option. Not to further complicate this, but there is a drug called Improvac, which I went on the internet and learned all about. Improvac, it's a drug that's used in Europe, especially Italy, that you inject into the testicles. It numbs the testicles and the backside. He feels nothing. You perform the castration, and within an hour, he's fine, supposedly. It is illegal in this country, Improvac. So I'd have to smuggle it in through Canada. And I felt like being caught at the border with illegal contraband or whatever that is was not worth the risk for Boris. And then there's a fifth option, which is just take him to an auction, and that requires driving him out to Iowa and selling him for about 10 cents a pound or 15 cents a pound, depending if you're lucky. And I'm hoping Boris would get like 18 cents a pound. But you'd have to drive him out there. And once you're in auction, they treat those. I mean, this is meat that goes to dog food, basically. And they treat Boris terribly. He's cattle prodded, and he lives a life for a week or so that's unimaginable and unconscionable for us. So it's sort of not a choice. When I spoke to Bill Nyman about this, he said, "Now you know why pepperoni pizza was invented." So I wanted, in the remaining little time here, to open up this session, not just give my point of view, but give a series of points of view, if you will, and sort of give you the perspective of several different people who have contact and, in this case, relationships with Boris, and what their point of view is on this problem, which still exists as we're sitting here today. You're looking at Craig Haney. Craig Haney is the livestock farmer, and Craig bought Boris 6 years ago with his wife, Amy, at their farm, and Boris sired many pigs for him, and then he and Amy got divorced. Amy got the farm, and he got Boris. Boris sired many animals many pigs for us that we used for years. And so with Craig, his point of view is like it's the most ambivalent. He has the most ambivalent personality about Boris you could ever imagine. On the one hand, he wants to go out and shoot him between the eyes, like he mentioned to me, and I feel like this is probably like a classic case of transference. He's taken his wife and put her into Boris, and he wants to shoot him. I think he wants to castrate him and then shoot him. And then, depending on which way the wind is blowing, the next hour, you'll see him caressing Boris like this, basically with tears in his eyes, and trying to do everything to keep Boris alive. Again, my philosophical understanding of this is that he's kind of still in love with Amy, and it's the only thing that ties their marriage together. So his opinion goes back and forth, and he's the ultimate guy who decides. But he's got some people who have very strong opinions that work for him and work around him. One of them is Julie, and Julie is, let's just say, she's very opinionated. She's the livestock assistant to Craig. She's very opinionated, very precocious. I would label her as a very angry woman. She does not like me, so I have to be honest about that. And in part because she thinks I want to keep Boris alive as a mascot. And so I wanted to give you some quotes. She said, "I don't like him, Dan. No, I don't. And it's colored by the fact that he's not practical. Dan," she said, "this is not a petting zoo. And by keeping him alive, you are creating one." I'm creating one. I said, okay. So she went on to say, he tries to mount the sows, and he pushes himself on them in a way that I don't like. And she said, he forces himself on the young ladies too, as if they're a bunch of Lolitas. Lolita didn't seem to care when she was getting it on with Humpert Humpert. But does that make it right? Patrick, second assistant to Craig. A little less angry, but no less opinionated. He has real problems with people petting Boris. When they pet Boris, he says, that really galls me. My ultimate problem with him, Dan, involves real estate. He's set up to what I consider to be a prime grazing area, and he's taking away grass and woodland from pigs that would otherwise be very happy to be there. There's Jack, who is our vegetable farmer, the guy who raises our carrots and such. And Jack has a very competitive relationship with Craig, and actually with all the livestock farmers. There's a little bit of competition between the vegetables and the animals. And he's extremely opinionated, and I just mentioned Boris to him just in passing. We were walking around the farm, and he turned around to me and said, hey man, A+, #1, textbook, El Stupido decision is to name your freaking boar. Should have named him P22, man. Once you name him, you're screwed. All sorts of attachment issues and the rest of the stuff, it's crazy. And then he stopped and he looked out in his field, like proud, just proud, like a king overlooking his castle, and he said, hey, man, when something's not productive in my field, I rip it out, immediately, right away, gone, goodbye. And as he was saying that, he was standing, and I caught him, in front of his fig tree. And for those of you who know, fig trees probably produce, in our greenhouse, they probably produce 3 figs a month. And I said, Jack, what about the fig tree? And I just sort of pointed at it, and he turned a little red and got quiet. And a minute later, he said, yeah, okay, I suppose figs are my Boris. And then there's Paul Willis, who's a friend of the farm and a friend he's a friend of animals. I mean, but he's considered, he's the one who created the protocol for Nyman Ranch. And PETA and all the humane animal people consider him their poster child. He's one of the most gentle men I've ever met. And he said to me over the phone, I called him up and told him the situation, and he interrupted me. He said, Dan, do you have a backhoe with a front end loader? And I said, yes, I do, Paul. Okay, then what you're going to want to do is chain Boris's front legs. You're going to lift the backhoe with his belly up 5 feet, and you're going to castrate him, and then you're going to get back to work. So that was Paul. There was Irene, who works for me, and she's a mid-40-year-old woman who feels very impassioned about women's issues, and she came barreling into my office last week and said, well, if you're thinking about this and writing about this, why aren't you writing about Sophie the Sofa? Sophie the Sofa was a sow that was brought to the farm to give birth to many pigs, and she ended up falling short. She ended up never getting pregnant, and she was slaughtered immediately. So she thought this was a sexism issue. There's Pete Bradley, who's our business manager, and Pete has been married for 20 years and had never had a child. Started taking care of Boris on his day off. On Mondays when the restaurant is closed, he fed him twice a day and started a bond with him. And after a year of taking care of him, gave birth to a child. So when I asked him his opinion about Boris, he said, I think Boris is doing great. I think he's striving. He's going to come back, and he's going to make those sows pregnant. So transference is probably himself on Boris. And then I called, actually this morning on my way here, I called Rabbi Rabinowitz from the Westchester Synagogue. And Rabbi comes to eat quite often at Blue Hill. We've been trading messages all week. He loves pork. And he's very reformed. And he said, I explained the situation with Boris, the options, and there was silence on the phone. He said, tough one. I think castration. No drugs, don't import anything, very illegal. You wouldn't do that. But the question for him was, how do you justify the castration? And his response was, give 20% of the sausage meat to the House for the Homeless in Westchester. And that way, your profits aren't just monetary, they're profits for the less fortunate. And then all of a sudden, he started to go on in what I thought was going to be just a brilliant summation of what to do with Boris. And I swear to God, he was on his way to a bris, and the phone went staticky. And I couldn't hear what he was saying. And my theory, and as before I walked in here, as I was sitting in the parking lot, was that God was interrupting us. And so I'll have to call him afterwards and find out what it. But suffice to say, he had an interesting take on it. And then, so finally, my point of view. You know, I'm really ambivalent myself, and I'm so political. It's like every time I talk to one of these people, I don't want to upset anyone, and so I take their point of view so I don't cause any more friction. But here's what I've learned, in all seriousness, and I want to sort of tie together the carrot story in this. And that's what I've learned as being a chef on a farm, such as this. It's that if you bring a story, if you're able to tell stories to our diners, if chefs, farmers, winemakers, cheesemakers, et cetera, can attach stories to what they're producing, like where the food's from, who's producing it, how is it being grown, what decisions are being made when it's grown, all of those, whether it's a carrot or a pork sausage, we are feeding people on another level. And we invite people to become involved. And when they become involved, they become invested. And when they're invested, they start to own their own story. And when they own their own story, they become impassioned. And when you get them impassioned, they have a very strong point of view. So my toast to all of you for this weekend is that we hear some very strong points of view. Thank you.